And it'll be bad for the red states, too. I think the spectacle of having desperate women prosecuted as murderers for going out of state to terminate a pregnancy or taking illegal medication at home, this will be bad for business. I think you'll find that corporations don't much like being associated with a real-life version of The Handmaid's Tale. But again, this will only hurt red states. But I don't think the problem necessarily stops here. Right? I do think there's a larger concern about creeping theocracy. Now, let's call this for what it is, right? What happened here? The unjustified and unjustifiable religious beliefs of Catholics on the Supreme Court have delivered this change in our society. This is religion, pure and simple. There is simply no valid ethical argument that privileges the interests of a single fertilized ovum over those of a woman whose life is going to be completely deranged by being forced to have a child. It's not just that pro-life absolutists have bad arguments. They have no arguments for banning abortion at the earliest stages. But then pro-choice absolutists are also extremists. Anyone who would argue for abortion as an absolute right of a woman at every stage of pregnancy, as though terminating a fetus in the third trimester had no ethical implications beyond a woman's bodily autonomy, such people are just not making contact with the real ethical terrain here. So our political debate about abortion seems pretty confused, and it ignores the very sensible intuitions that most people have on this topic. I mean, most people recognize that a clump of cells is not a person, while a 30-week-old fetus is so close to being a bouncing baby that it is a person. The real problem here is to figure out where that change happens, and therefore where it becomes ethically complicated to terminate a pregnancy. The most important question for me is, at what point in development can a fetus conceivably suffer? That's not the only consideration, but I think it's the main one. And here it's reasonable to think that sensory connections to the cortex are the relevant threshold. We can be even more conservative than that and draw the line somewhere earlier, but it's not an accident that most people think that the first trimester and the third trimester are very different, ethically speaking. And the difference is in the presence or absence of the nervous system structures that could conceivably produce suffering. Terminating a pregnancy at 10 weeks is just different than terminating one at 30 weeks. Given what we know about developmental neuroscience, I would say that the first should be at the total discretion of the mother, and the second should require very serious justification, like saving the mother's life, or saving the child from some utterly horrific suffering, should it be born. And obviously, emergency late-term abortions should and do include anesthesia. At a certain stage in pregnancy, you have to treat a fetus as a being who can suffer. But over 90% of abortions happen in the first trimester. And given what we know, that should be a legal practice available to all women, especially given what we know about the effects on a society that outlaws that practice. Ultimately, there's a lot of ethical work still ahead of us to understand human development in a fine-grained way, and to specify exactly where a fetus, even a specific fetus, becomes a person to which we want to ascribe independent interests. But most people know that the extremes are very different, 10 weeks and 30 weeks, say. And where we draw the line should be somewhere in the middle of that range. And yet our political discourse tends not to reflect this. But the fact that we appear to be moving into a situation where abortion at every stage will be illegal in half the country, that is clearly a step backwards, politically and ethically. And we have Iron Age religion to thank for it. Okay. Today I'm speaking with Morgan Housel. Morgan is a partner at the Collaborative Fund and a former columnist at the Motley Fool and the Wall Street Journal. He is a two-time winner of the Best in Business Award from the Society of American Business Editors and Writers. So Also the winner of the New York Times Sydney Award and a 2-time finalist for the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism. And he has written a wonderful book titled The Psychology of Money, Timeless Lessons on Wealth, Greed, and Happiness. And this is the topic of our conversation. We discuss how personal history shapes one's view of economic risk, the implications of not understanding the future, the difference between rich and wealthy, how we measure success, the problem of social comparison, happiness versus life satisfaction, saving and investing, Warren Buffett and the power of compounding, rational versus reasonable decisions, the role of luck, optimism versus pessimism, dollar cost averaging, and other topics. Anyway, I found it a very useful conversation, and I hope you do as well. And I bring you Morgan Housel. I am here with Morgan Housel. Morgan, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
So you wrote this really wonderful book, The Psychology of Money, Timeless Lessons on Wealth, Greed, and Happiness. And I want to talk about a lot of what's in that book and anything else you think on these topics. But before we jump in, I guess 2 things. I want to acknowledge that we're having this conversation at an interesting moment. We seem poised on the brink of some kind of recession, and the stock market has been fairly crazy. And just one interesting reference point that jumped out at me. I think at some point in your book you single out Netflix as a company that has made stratospheric gains, and I now notice that Netflix has lost almost all of those gains. It certainly lost 5 years worth of gains seemingly overnight. So a lot can change here, obviously, and we don't know when people will be listening to this conversation. I think this will be evergreen, and they're just very different moments in the life of any economy, in the life of any person. It's fascinating to see how it's changed even since your book was published.
It's interesting for sure. What I would note too, something with Netflix you mentioned. What I mentioned in the book is Netflix during a period of 2002 to 2018 increased like 500-fold. It went up 500-fold. That's just cherry picking in hindsight. But during that period, it lost. It's interesting for sure. What I would note too, something with Netflix you mentioned. What I mentioned in the book is Netflix during a period of 2002 to 2018 increased like 500-fold. It went up 500-fold. That's just cherry picking in hindsight. But during that period, it lost 70% of its value twice.
Right.
And it lost half of its value on 6 separate occasions, despite increasing 500-fold during that period. I think that's relevant today as it goes through another 70% climb, as you pointed out. That I think a lot of what we deal with in the economy and the stock market, whenever we go through these periods like we have in the last 6 months, when a lot of things decline and collapse and there's a lot of volatility, I think the huge majority of what we are experiencing is normal volatility, normal accidents, normal uncertainty that you should expect with 100% certainty to occur during your life in the stock market, in the economy. It's rarely phrased like that. It's always, even in the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg and the Financial Times, it's phrased as like crisis, surprise, catastrophe. Even if what we are dealing with is something that has always occurred at fairly regular intervals and will always occur at fairly regular intervals.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of the details there when we talk about investing and just the psychology of it. But before we jump in, perhaps you can summarize your background. How did you come to focus on money and wealth and related matters? And perhaps this might be the time to talk about the way in which a person's personal history can provide a lens through which they look at these topics, and it's a lens that's fairly difficult to change. So I think you have some interesting things in your book on that topic. How does personal history and personal bias play in here as well?
Well, I had a pretty unique background starting in my teenage years. I was a competitive ski racer growing up in Lake Tahoe, and because I was a competitive ski racer, I more or less bypassed high school. Not because I was smart enough to bypass it, just because it was viewed as getting in the way of competitive ski racing. So I did an independent study program for high school that was a joke. There was effectively no academics involved. It was a program that was designed for juvenile delinquents, which I was not one. but that's what it was designed for. And I did nothing. I did basically no academic work for it. When I was 16, they gave me a piece of paper that said diploma on it. But for all intents and purposes, I had an 8th grade education, and then I stopped after that. And during my teenage years, it was a lot of fun. I was ski racing all over the world. It was great. But as I became a later teen, 18, 19 years old, and all my friends started going off to college, I had this moment of, what now? What do I do? They all have this skill set in terms of a high school education that I did not. And they're all going into college that I felt I was completely inadequately prepared for, which I was. I started as a valet at a high-end hotel in Lake Tahoe during that period, and that was my first exposure to wealthy people. I grew up in a middle-class household, but I'd never been exposed to very wealthy people. And at the hotel, you had people coming in their Ferraris and their Rolls Royces, and I had just never seen that before. And as I was 19 years old, I was very naive in my worldview. My first reaction as a 19-year-old man was, I want to be that guy. The guy driving the yellow Ferrari, that's who I want to be. And I think it's funny now because that's like the opposite of what I want to be, what I aspire to. But that was my first view of like, there is another side of the world out there that I don't know about, and I want it, and I want it badly. And so this was the early 2000s. The huge majority of those people who I met, who were very wealthy, worked in finance. And that was kind of my first exposure to like, okay, I want to get into finance because I want to be that guy. And I had this chip on my shoulder in terms of my lack of education. And as the years went on, I finally started college when I was about 20. And I had to start at the most remedial levels of effectively, I stopped at 8th grade, and I had to start back at that level at a local junior college, community college. Eventually worked my way up. I graduated from USC. It took me many years to get there. I think I was in college for 6, maybe 7 years if you added it all up, because I had to make up for so much lost time. But my entire goal during that period was I want to work in finance. I want to be an investment banker. I want to move to New York and work for Goldman Sachs. That's what I wanted to do. And during the early 2000s, that's what a lot of young men in particular wanted to do, because investment banking had this allure of like, that's where the power, that's where the money is. And when you're 21, 22 years old, you're just so enamored by that. And then, so I was going to be an investment banker. And then I got an investment banking internship in Los Angeles.
And you did your degree in economics?
That's right. Yeah, I have a BA in economics from USC. And so I started this investment banking internship. And this was my dream. This is what I had aspired to do. I put all my eggs in this one basket. And on day one, not even day one, like hour one of this investment banking internship, I realized it was not for me. This is just not going to work. The culture of investment banking, particularly back then, was really geared towards hazing.